If you can't get it working, don't worry, there's always someone else who can pick up where you left off. So a coworker reached out to me and asked if I could look at their chainsaw, but they didn't give me a lot of information about it. Now what typically happens is that they can't get something started, and that's when they'll hand it off to me. This one, however, was a bit different. This time it turns out they had someone else work on it, and even though it's better, it's still not right. So why is it that I'm the one who's supposed to fix it? In today's video, we're going to look at this entry-level Stihl chainsaw, and the problem is that it starts and runs, but it only runs for a little bit and then it stops. Like I already mentioned, someone already worked on it, and I'm getting their seconds, if you know what I mean. Now after looking at it, especially after having cleaned it, you can see it's in really good shape. Now I'm not really sure why the bar and chain are not on here, but I'm sure they had their reasons. Now I'm going to try and repair this chainsaw, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. So it seems at some point someone decided to remove the spark arrestor screen, which is something I would recommend not doing, only because leaving it on will help to reduce the chances of starting a fire, but it is your saw, so do what you want with it. Now at this point, I think it's important to see the issue it's having firsthand and see if it's the same issue yours is having, or if you might know what's wrong with it. As you can see, it starts up quite normally. There's really nothing wrong with how it starts. The only thing I can see from how it starts and eventually stops is that the stop is somewhat abrupt. Now it's not stopping as though we're shutting it off with the off switch, but it would seem it's running out of fuel. That would of course point us to the carb as the main issue, but as you'll see here in a bit, that's kind of difficult to believe. Now I need to take out the spark plug because I want to perform a compression test just to make sure someone didn't damage the engine by running it on fuel that did not have enough oil in it. Now the compression tester will show us how much pressure the engine can make on the compression stroke. The more pressure it makes, the better, but if the reading is low, it could point to some serious issues with the engine. So the reading is a very healthy 156 psi. That means this engine has not been damaged in any way and is in great working condition. Now if your reading is below 90 psi, it could mean there's some wear on the engine, and if the reading is below 60 psi, it's doubtful the engine would even start, and if it does start, it's going to be down in power. So they gave me this box a day or two after getting the saw, and I thought it contained a new carb that they wanted me to install, but after looking inside it, I soon realized that was not the case at all. So this box is from the aftermarket and not an OEM supplier, and once I opened it, it turns out there are a few used parts in it, including the original Stihl carb, dirt and all. So I was kind of uncertain why they would give me the original carb. The only thing I was thinking is that would give me the opportunity to service the original carb and maybe use it instead of the cheap aftermarket one that's most likely on the saw right now. Well, the only thing left to do then is to clean up the old carb, take it apart for an inspection, and see if I can service it. There's just one issue with this carb, and it's a pretty dirty thing to do to the consumer. What they did was to remove the ability to adjust the fuel delivery for the carb. They did this by installing the pins into the carb where the fuel adjustment screws would go and not have any screw heads to be able to adjust the positions of the pins. Now in the cleaning video for the saw, I got a lot of great comments on why they would do this, and most of the comments were fantastic and made sense, but the idea that they would hamstring the consumer this way kind of ruined my perception of the brand for me. After taking the cover off for the pumping section on the carb, we can see the inlet screen, and as you can see, the screen is very dark in color, which is not normal. Typically, it should look like a fine mesh screen and silver in color, but instead it's covered in fine dirt. Now, believe it or not, this dirt was in the fuel and was able to make it past the filter. Most of the time, what happens is that the fuel line will break at the filter, and then the carb will pull in unfiltered fuel that's captured by the screen. This will eventually clog the screen and then block any fuel from leaving the carb and making it to the engine. Now to safely clean the screen, I'm going to remove the metering diaphragm and the needle and rocker arm. Now while the diaphragm is off the carb, we can also inspect its condition. The diaphragm is supposed to be soft and flexible, that way it can work the rocker arm underneath it, but as expected, it's not flexible. If I had to rate this one, it would be extremely poor, and that means we need to replace it. Now, if yours is somewhat soft, it might still work, but if you're not sure, it's best to just replace it. Now, this one is not completely dried up, so I'm going to throw it into my rejuvenation bath just in the off chance I'll need to use it in a future project. However, if it's too brittle, there's simply no chance in saving it. Now, I buy my diaphragms in bulk, so each one is very inexpensive, but if you buy a single one, it's going to be a lot of money. In fact, you'd be better off just buying a cheap aftermarket carb instead. So here's the new replacement, and as you can see, it's extremely soft and supple. That means it can easily move the way it's supposed to work the rocker arm that's underneath it. Now, the most important part you're looking for is the stem in the middle. They can either be long or short, and this one happens to be the shorter one. The next item we need to look at is the pumping diaphragm. We need to make sure it's also able to move the way it's supposed to, otherwise you could be in for some trouble. The thing is, if yours looks like this one, it's most likely going to work, but if yours looks like the same material as the metering diaphragm, you might have some issues. The reason is this rubberized membrane can harden, while this type is a type of mylar that won't harden. This is something you won't have to worry about when working on newer machines, but if you find yourself working on an older machine, you'll have to watch out for it. Now, after removing the rocker arm and the spring, we can't take out the needle just yet with the gasket in the way. Now, be very careful when doing this because you can still reuse it, otherwise you'll need to replace it. Also, be very careful because you can easily lose these tiny parts. That's one reason why it's just easier to replace the carb versus servicing it. Once these tiny parts are put in a safe place, we can now use some carb cleaner to clean the screen. Now, I've been asked if using something like WD-40 would work, and to be honest, I never tried it, so I don't know, but it wouldn't hurt to try it out. Now, after you think it's clean enough, try putting some fuel in the pocket for the screen and see if the fuel will pass through it. If it doesn't, then you'll have to keep cleaning it. But if it does, then we can keep moving on. Now, at this point, I would normally take out the fuel adjustment screws and try cleaning their passages, but since I can't do that, our chances of cleaning the carb are not that great, but at least we gave it a shot. Now, at this point, the only thing left to do is to put the carb back together and hope that it works out. Now, this is the part of the procedure where things can go terribly wrong. It's at this time where I've lost either the spring or the pin for the rocker arm, so be very cautious. Just don't do what I'm doing, which is to do this repair in the grass. For those of you who have seen my past videos, you'll know that I've lost a part or two after dropping them in the lawn. Once the rocker arm is back in the carb, check to make sure it's moving like it's supposed to. If not, you'll have to take it out and try it again. After that, replace the gasket and then the metering diaphragm. Now, after seeing this process, and if you like a challenge, then try to service the carb yourself. But if you like things to be easy and challenge-free, just try replacing the carb instead. You'll have a much better time. But that brings us to a bigger question. If that's what someone did to this one, then why is it still having issues? So this part is the real mystery to this entire repair. The only thing I could come up with was that the carb they got to replace this one with was a lemon, which does happen from time to time, and from my own experience, it's happened maybe once or twice in the decade I've been doing this. We'll find out here in a bit once we take off the aftermarket carb and replace it with the serviced OEM carb. Now, servicing it is not going to guarantee that it's going to work, but as you'll see here in a bit, things only get weirder. Now, just because Stihl went and did something like removing the adjustment screws doesn't mean I'm not going to buy their stuff, but it does force me to buy a more expensive model to avoid this very situation. Now, typically, if a saw was having this kind of situation, I would attempt to fix it by making adjustments to the carb and increasing the fuel delivery, but seeing how there are no screws to adjust, well, that plan went out the window. Now, to be quite honest, taking out the carb and swapping it doesn't take any real time, and I got really good at it. If you couldn't tell, that was a bit of foreshadowing the terrible events to come. Now, when researching for carbs that had adjustment screws that I could swap on here, one of the research results showed me one that I could use. Now, when I saw the picture of the carb they said would fit, I didn't believe it, but after doing more research, it would seem that their carb they were offering would indeed work. There's just one small issue with it, though. The issue is that there are no openings in the cover to allow you to adjust the carb while it's running. That means you'll need to remove the cover to make your adjustments and then replace the cover to make your test cuts. The other change is you'll have to cover up a round opening in the air filter base, but that shouldn't be that difficult either. Now, if this saw happens to come back to me, I might consider swapping carbs on it instead of trying to service it again. I will let them know what I plan on doing first, just to make sure they're okay with the idea. Oh, and if it does come back, I'll have to ask them to leave the bar and chain on it, that way I can make some test cuts with it. The only thing I could come up with was that they were waiting for a new bar and chain to show up and simply gave it to me thinking that it wouldn't be a real issue. So we're almost ready to get this saw started and see if it's going to stay running or if it's going to start, run for a bit, and then stop again. Now if it does have the same issue again, the problem might not be the carb because the engine is still acting the same way. That means the cause of our problem may be somewhere else other than the carb. If you can't tell by my explanation before getting the saw started, things don't go according to plan, which means this mystery gets a lot more complicated than I was expecting, and the results will not be good for anyone. Now the engine ran like that because it was running on the fuel that I sprayed into the carb's throat. This should have caused the carb to pull fuel from the tank, and the fuel system should not have any air in it anymore. So this is not the kind of response I wanted to see from the engine. We're going to try that one more time and see if it's better the second time. If it doesn't stay running this time, we're going to need to come up with a different plan. So unfortunately things have not changed at all, which is kind of strange considering we serviced the original carb and swapped it back onto the engine. Now I have to figure out if we need to get yet another carb or if there's something we're missing on this one. So my question is, if this was your project, what would you do? Get another aftermarket carb, get an OEM carb for 3 times the price, or would you keep digging into the fuel system and see if there's some other cause for our issue? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.